So I'm going to be talking about assignment 6 and just give you an outline for how I would go about solving this problem. So assignment 6 is actually broken out into two parts. So I've only given you assignment 6 part 1, but I have given you an example program that you can use to look at the full functionality that actually also implements the part 2 functionality, which has to do with changing the seat, adding passenger, delete passengers, and then filling in the passengers taken seats up here. So I'm going to go over some of that, but just remember for the first part of assignment 6, only implement those requirements that for that, and part 2 you'll get the next set of requirements. But again, I'm going to go over both in this. So when I'm presented with an application like this, I go through the requirements and I create some sort of UI like this, which I've actually already given you. You're welcome to copy this basic design if you'd like. So I've got my combo boxes. I've also got over here, you'll notice that I've got two canvas controls. Now I wanted to point this out on how I did this. And so I've created a top level canvas. And then within that top level canvas, you notice how I have this label right here. Then I have this sub canvas. Now the reason I did that is because I wanted this canvas to have nothing but these labels inside of it, which represent my seats. That way, I can easily loop through the children of this canvas in order to be able to access all of these various labels here. That'll make more sense later on when we have to actually fill in the taken seats for the passenger. What I've also done is I just copied all of this and I pasted it down here again, but I created the other flight. But you'll notice its visibility is just collapsed. And so what I'm going to do is when you select the flight here, I'm going to make this one visible and this one invisible, and then vice versa based on which choose flight was selected. Alright, so with this basic program then, I start thinking through how I'm going to solve this problem. So first we have to figure out how to load up the flights and load up the passengers from the database. Now real quick, don't forget where your exe is at, that's where you want to put your database files that I've already given you. And also remember that I've given you all of the SQL statements that you'll need for this class, especially assignment 6. Again, most students haven't taken a database class, so I'm trying to give you as much information, but I want you to experience actually querying a database, pulling data back, etc. So, how do we fill up flights? Well, one of the things that I almost always do is I think to myself about the data that I'm going to be displaying to the user, and I realize, okay, this is going to be a list of flights. So I would come over here and do add a class, and I would call this something like CLS flight. Now in this flight class, the purpose of it is just to hold data, so there's not going to be any methods inside of it. So I know that I'm going to create just some public properties for the flight ID, for the flight number, and the aircraft type. And this was done because I'd read the requirements, I looked at the data in the database, and there's three things that represent a flight in the database table. Now what I also want to make sure to do is because this flight class, I'm going to be creating an object for each flight and then binding it to this combo box here, I want to make sure that I override the toString method. So don't forget to do that, because that toString method is what the combo box calls in order to know how to display the flights in this combo box here. So that's all this flight does. Now, the next thing I would do is I would say to myself, okay, I know that I have all these SQL statements, again, that the teacher has already given me. So what I would do is I would come in here and I would create a class called CLS SQL. Now this SQL class, I'm just going to copy some code here and paste it here for you, just real quick. And the reason I've done this is because I know that I'm going to have to get some flights from the database. It's nice to have your SQL statements in a separate class like this. You notice how it does virtually nothing. This is giving me an error just because it needs a using statement. So if you just highlight this here, you can see using system.reflection puts it up there. Now it's happy. So the reason I'm doing this is because as you're giving your code peer review to other developers or database administrators, things like this, they know that they can look in one single place and it'll have all of your SQL statements. So again, imagine you had 100 different SQL statements in your code, but it was scattered throughout 100 different files in your project versus having all those 100 SQL statements in just one file, or here this particular class. And that way, if you ever do have a SQL statement that crashes, which you will, you know exactly where to look. And same thing, you could also give this class to like a database administrator, and they could go through your SQL statements, see what makes sense to have SQL statements in your code versus there's ways you can actually put them on the database server and various things. So I just find that this is a helpful way to do this. So again, I've given you a bunch of these SQL statements. So first thing I would do is I would just put them in a class like this. And I know that I'm going to have to get the flights. So that's why this is going to return this SQL statement that I already gave you, and that's all it's going to do. I also know that in order to get the passengers here, I've given you an SQL statement right here called get passengers, this method. Here's the SQL statement I gave you. And in the SQL, I know I have to tack on the flight ID of the flight. So what that means is there's two flights. So flight ID 1, flight ID 2 in the database. And so you have to actually tell it which flight you want to get this passenger's data from. And so that's what this SQL statement would do. But now mind you, we're not actually executing the SQL statements, we're just returning it. So those are what I would set up there. So now that I've got this SQL class, I've got my flight class, now what I would do is I know I'm actually going to have to create some business logic here. So I would create another class, something like CLS Flight Manager. Call it whatever you want, but this is the business logic for your flight class. And so I'm thinking to myself now, okay, I need to create this Flight Manager class, and I'm going to need to create a method in order to what? Well, get the flights from this using this SQL that I just created. Now you'll notice that I made this static because it didn't really make sense. There's no state, and so if you create it static, then you can just use the class name dot. So for example, over here in the Flight Manager, I have to create a method for that. You can see that if I do that, I can just access the method directly, and that'll give me the SQL that I need. So what I need to do now here is I'm going to say to myself, okay, I know that I'm going to have a method called something like get flights. And so I would actually stub out something like this before I even code anything. Again, you're prototyping it, you're thinking through, you're skeletoning out the code. So what does this get flights method have to do? Well, I know that I have to access this method here. In my SQL here, get flights. So I know that I'm going to call, the SQL class dot get flights. And that gives me just the SQL statement that I need. And now I can execute that SQL statement. Now that I have all those returned, it's going to return to me in a data set. So now I can loop through the data set. And then for each row, I can create a new CLS flight class, fill it up with data, and then add it to what? So I've got this flight, but I'm going to have multiple flights, so I want to create a list of flights that I'm going to add it to. So this list of flights will just be a local variable, so it looks something like this, list CLS flight. You can even see how it fills it in for me there with the autocorrect. So this would be in my method, and I would create a new one of these, so I'd actually say equals new. And then in my code, I would be looping through and I would keep adding different flights to this class. And that's my get flights method. Now using that, I know I can get all my flights. So let's go back to the main window now. So in my main window, when the application first starts, I'm going to think to myself, okay, I need to get the flights. So first, I'm going to want a local variable here with that Flight Manager class. And then in my main window, I can say, okay, I know I've got this combo box here. And so you can see that's choose flight. So what I want to have happen is I want to actually bind to its item source property. Because I don't want to have to loop through a list and keep adding the items. I actually just want to bind it to the source. So what am I going to do here? Well, I just created a method here called get flights. So again, I would just stub out something like this, and then I would just call this get flights method. And that'd be all I have to do, because this is going to take care of all the logic. So you can see how there's no business logic behind my UI here. All I'm doing is just binding that to my item source of my combo box. And now I'm done. So now once I run this, that's actually going to give me my flights. So what's the next thing I need to do? Well, now I need to worry about my passengers. So again, in my SQL statement, I got my passengers over here. I can get the flight ID when the user selects something from the choose flight. So I can get the flight ID, I could pass it into here. So now I need to figure out how to display my passengers. So it's exactly the same as my flight. So I can just say CLS passenger. And so now I've got this passenger class. I know from the requirements and the database that I've got a passenger ID. Again, these would probably be auto-implemented properties. I have a first name and a last name. Also, don't forget to override the toString method. So there we go. I've got my passenger class. And now what I want to do is I'm going to have a CLS passenger manager. And just like we did for our other class, for our flight manager, we're going to have the same sort of idea. So we go to our passenger manager class, and we know that we're going to have some sort of method that's going to get the passengers. Now when we get the passengers, remember over here in our SQL statement, we had to pass in this flight ID. So, alright, so our get passengers, we're going to have this string s flight ID that actually gets passed into us here. Then we can use the SQL statement here in this get passengers. So it'd be something like, CLS SQL dot get passengers. So that would give us the SQL. Oops, sorry, this is wrong class. The passenger manager, sorry. So this method, inside of it, we're going to call this get passengers just to give us that string that holds the SQL for our statement. Now we can execute it. That'll give us a data set. Then we can loop through our data set and create a new passenger for each row. And there we go. So just like we did over here, we're going to create a list, but instead of flights, we're going to create a list of passengers. And then for each row, we create a new passenger, fill it up with the passenger ID and the first name and last name, and then we can return that list. Where are we going to return it to? Well, when the user, come back over here to our choose flight selection index changed. So when the user selects a different flight here, this method goes off. So what do we need to do? Well, let's think about that. So what's the first thing we're going to want to do? Well, let's get the selected flight. Now remember, we've filled up this combo box here with a list of flights. So what we could actually do now is I could say something like CLS selected flight equals, because we have to cast it. Now watch this. Combo choose flight dot selected item. Now we have all of the selected flights information that the user has selected. And so what we can do now, you'll notice, is get, for instance, the flight ID. Whoop, this is selected flight. Oh, I haven't actually created the methods. But so here we could do, S flight ID. Hadn't actually implemented those yet, but that would pop up. And so over here in the flight class, remember we had all these different properties. We filled up the flight ID, so we can just extract that now from our selected flight. Based on which flight is selected. Now, there would be better ways to do this, but for our assignment, it's pretty easy because we have the two flights. Again, in the real world, you make it dynamic based on how many flights are in the database right there. But for our assignment, it's not too big a deal. So what we can say is just the flight ID equals 1. Then, display the appropriate flight over here. Else, display the other one. Display the flight. So next what we need to do is just like we did up here for our flights, we need to get our passengers. So back here in the passenger manager class, notice how we had a passengers. So we want to instantiate a passenger manager class, would be the first thing we'd want to do. So just like we did this here, we're going to create a passenger manager class. We're then going to use that, and we're going to call this get passengers method. And remember, it takes a flight ID. So it takes a flight ID. Well, where do we get the flight ID? Well, we just had that from right here. So we had that selected flight object, and so we can just get that. Now what we can do is, now that we have all these selected flights, we can then assign that to the passenger combo box, just like we did here. That's all we'd have to do after this next statement here. So now we've bound all of our passenger flights to our combo box. So now when the user runs the application, the flights will be filled up. Based on when they select a flight, then the combo box for the passengers will be filled up. Now we also have to implement an add passenger screen. So I've created that one over here for us. Now for the first part, there's no requirements. It just has to pop up and close. So that's really all I've done so far here. Now for the second part of the assignment, we now need to implement where when we select a flight, we need to load this flight with all the selected seats. So if there's passengers on seat 2, 6, and 10, then seats 2, 6, and 10 would turn red because the seat's taken. Then from there, a user has to be able to click any of these seats. If it's a taken seat, like number 2, then over here we need to select the combo box of the selected passenger, fill up their seat. If they click delete, then we would delete that passenger, turn this back to blue, and then refill this index here. If they clicked change seat, then they have to, so passenger selected, they click change seat, then they have to click an empty seat. So if there's an empty seat, then we would change the passenger seat in the database. Add passenger, we're going to open up the other window, allow the user to enter, you can see the first name and last name, come back to the main window, and to be able to choose a seat for that passenger. So let's walk through that now. So the first thing we're going to want to have to do is right when the passenger chooses a flight. Now remember, this is for the second part of the assignment, so you would want to wait till I send you out the requirements to implement this. But let's go ahead and work through this now. So over here, when we actually chose a flight, what do we want to do? Well, we want to fill up the passenger seats. So in our method for choose flights, we know that we're going to want to do something like fill passenger seats. So we think to ourselves, okay, we're going to have another method, something like fill passenger seats. So what's going to happen in this fill passenger seats class? Well, several things. So the first thing, think about this. Each time you're going to set these, what if the user has deleted, or what if they've selected a new flight, etc., etc. So you always want to be careful and reset all of these to blue is the first thing that you're going to want to do. So we'll just put that in here for a comment. So reset all the seats to blue. Now that we've reset all the seats to blue, what we want to do is set those seats to red that are taken. So we're going to loop through all of the passengers in our list. Now there's a couple ways that you could have done this. Up here, when they chose a flight, you could have had a class level variable that had the list of all the passengers in it. So you just create a list of passengers up here, which is always the current selected flight, its passengers. Or you could pass the list into this flight passenger seats. Either way. Next, what we want to do is we actually want to loop through the seats in the selected flight. So what I mean is so for if 767 is selected here, then you're going to loop through all of these labels in the canvas. Well, that's pretty easy to do. All you have to do is do 767 seats dot children. So if I came over here, I can paste this in. So loop through each seat in the selected flight like this dot children. Then what do? Well, we just make sure to see if the seat's taken. Well, how is it taken? Well, we look at the passenger seat and look at the label's content to see if they match. So remember, we're looping through these passenger. So that passenger object has its seat number in it. So you can look at that seat number, compare it to the content of the labels that we're looping through here, which you'll notice that like each one of these contents are just the same seat number. If they match, then we can change that background to red because the seat's taken. And that's our fill passenger's seat. So next we can talk about the add passenger. So when the user clicks add passenger window, let's kind of think about what actually is happening here in add passenger. So when the add passenger, when they click save, a mistake that students make sometimes is they'll actually create a passenger in the database if they click save here. Now while that's fine for our assignment, think about this in the real world. Think about if you ran this, you saved it here, came back to the main window, but didn't click on a seat, just closed the application. Well, now you have this passenger record that's just lost inside the database. It's never going to be used because you never assigned a flight to it. So a better way to do that is to not actually insert anything on this window. But instead, what we want to do is just sort of set, hey, we just need to know if they actually wanted to save this user's information or not. Go back to the main window, and then we can force them to select a seat. So again, if they press the save button, then set a local variable behind this window. So we just have a local variable and a property so that the main window can access it that says yes, the user did click the save button and they did not click the cancel button. So what does that mean? Just take them back to the main window. Don't insert the passenger here. So why are we taking them back to the main window? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to disable all of this stuff over here, and we're going to force them to click a seat here when they click the add passenger button. So now we've clicked the add passenger button, and this kind of brings up another point. So think about what has to happen here. We've added the passenger, and we've come back over here, and we're going to have to click a seat. Well, there's other things that can happen when we click a seat. For example, if you can click on a red seat, it means to select that passenger here. Or after you've clicked add passenger, you should only be clicking on empty seats here. If it's delete passenger, then you've already selected a passenger. So really there's three modes. There's the regular seat selection here, there's the change seat mode, and there's the add passenger mode. And so we're going to need some ways to keep that track. So if we come up to the top here, let's create some variables so that we know what mode we're in. And so you could create an enumeration, or you could just create a bunch of booleans that just say, hey, I'm in add passenger mode, or I'm in change seat mode. If both of these are false, then we know we're just in regular seat selection mode. So let's come back down here to our change seat, click again. And so on our add passenger method. And so now what we're going to want to do is we would go back to our window here, this add passenger window. We'd access it, and we'd make sure that the user clicked save. If they did, then go ahead and disable everything on the window so that the user is forced to click a seat. So we've clicked add passenger, it's popped up, they've clicked save. Now we've come back to the UI here, and we're going to force them to click a seat. So how do we do that? Well, we just set that variable be add passenger mode that we just created here at the top. Minimize some of these. So we know now that we are in add passenger mode, and we can continue on. So we don't actually have to do anything else in the add passenger click. What we're actually going to need to do is when they actually click a seat, we're going to have to check to see which mode you're in. So let's take a look at that. So again, we haven't inserted anything to the database here, but we do need to start handling some seat click events. So what I've done is I've actually handled the seat click event for this label, and then I copied and pasted it to these other labels. You would need to continue to copy and paste it to all of the other labels in this one and also the other canvas for the seats. And that way, no matter which button you click, it's always going to get called this seat click method right here. But now that we're in the seat click method, so this is the method that, no matter which seat gets clicked, the user is going to call it. Okay, so what do we have to do first? Well, we have to determine if we're in the add passenger mode, right? That's what we were just talking about. So here we go. What mode is the program in? Add passenger, change seat, or regular seat selection. So this is just an if statement. Hey, if we're in add passenger mode, then we can insert a new passenger into the database using the information that's on this window here, because you'll want to create some public properties on this window so that you can access the first and last name. Also insert a record into the link table. So you have to create a passenger record and then a link table record, which this link table record is just the, hey, this passenger is on this flight on this seat. And I've given you that SQL, and so you would do this in another class. So what class would you do this in? Well, this is passenger mode, so you'd probably go over here to the CLS passenger manager. You'd create another method here that's insert that user, and so you would, or add a passenger, something like that. And so you already have that code done, and you could just call it. So that's all we have to do now for add passenger. So now let's come over here to the change seat method. So when the user clicks change seat, what do we have to do? Well, what we want to do is we want to lock down the window. First, we want to make sure that the user is selected, or passenger is selected. And if a passenger is selected, we're going to want to lock down the window and set that change seat mode to true. So at the top there, we created this variable change seat mode. And so we just set that to true. And we're going to force the user to select a seat. And so the user came over here, they selected a passenger, clicked change seat, and now they have to, we're forcing them, we're going to lock all this down, then we're going to force them to click an empty seat over here. And so again, that's what this method here is going to handle. So what happens if we are in change seat mode? Well, we only want to change a seat when? Well, when they click on a blue seat or an empty seat. We don't want to do anything if they clicked on a red seat because it's already taken. And so if it is, we're going to click on a blue seat. If it's not, if it's empty, then we're going to update the link table to update the user's new seat, which again will be done in another class like the passenger manager class. So we can come over here and create another method that will actually update the passenger seat because we've changed their seat. Now what's the last thing we need to do in this seat click method? Well, over here in the regular seat selection, you can click on any taken seat you want, any red seat, and we should change this to green. We should highlight the passenger over here, and we should set their passenger seat there. So this is what we need to do. So I'll just add in the comments for that. Otherwise, in regular seat selection, if a seat is taken red, then loop through the passengers in the combo box and keep looping until that seat was clicked. If its number matches the passenger seat, then select the combo box index or the selected item and put the passenger seat in the label. So that's how you would go about actually setting that if they're just selecting a seat. So the last thing we need to worry about now is the delete passenger. So the first thing, obviously make sure there's a selected passenger. And then from there, we're going to have to do two things. One, we know we're going to have to delete a passenger. Then we're going to have to reload, because the passenger has been deleted, we have to reload this, and we need to reload all of our seats over here. So delete the currently selected passenger. So again, you would do that in the passenger manager class. So you wouldn't do it here in the UI. You would reload the passengers in the combo box, and then reload the taken seats. And so when you start stubbing it out like this, you'll notice things like, okay, reload taken seats, reload passengers. And so it might tell us that, hey, we need to, create some other methods like that we can do things like that. But as you kind of do an outline, you can see how you'll start thinking about how to fill that in. Now before I do any code here, what I would recommend doing is going to this SQL class, fully coding it, getting all the comments and attributes, and then try catch blocks done. Then I would make sure your flight class is fully coded. Then your flight manager class, I would code this and I would actually test it before I ever put it into the UI, so you know that this is working correctly. And I'll save you all kinds of headaches later. Then I would go to my passenger manager class, do the same thing, and same thing with this passenger class. Then I would come back to my main window and I would just start adding in those methods everywhere in order to, just walk through my comments calling those methods that I've already created. So hopefully that gives you kind of a general outline for this assignment. Just let me know if you have any questions.